ever get that feeling like you're just drowning in information? I mean, you read all these articles, but nothing really sticks.
Yeah.
Well, get ready to ditch those floaties and grab your Scooby gear, because in this deep dive, we're going to be exploring an article from Learnography.
Okay.
It's a blog by Shiva Narayan, and he's got this whole concept called learnography and how book reading can actually help you learn better
Interesting.
by fighting off something he calls cognitive blindness.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, this cognitive blindness thing. It's not like a specifically modern problem, though.
Right.
I mean, humans have probably struggled with like truly absorbing knowledge for as long as we've been, trying to learn things.
For sure. So this article describes cognitive blindness as a sort of mental block, right? Like you're reading the words, but they're not sinking in. Almost like when you're at a lecture and you zone out, even though the speaker is, doing their best.
Totally. Happens to the best of us, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So the article breaks it down into a few key symptoms.
Okay.
There's that feeling where you just can't grasp what you're reading at all.
Right.
Lack of any real interest in learning in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Struggling to remember the things that you do read.
Yeah.
Having these like fragmented bits of knowledge, but not the whole picture.
Yeah, and the author uses this term weak definition spectrum,
Okay.
meaning you can use a word, but you can't really explain it clearly.
I see. Okay. I'm starting to see how this cognitive blindness thing can play out in everyday life.
Yeah.
But the article claims that reading books can help overcome these challenges.
Right.
Engaging different circuits in the brain.
Exactly. The article highlights how reading taps into our cognitive limbic motor and mirror neuron systems,
Wow.
and along with something called the Zyed circuit,
Okay.
all working together to help us process and retain information.
Okay, so break that down for me.
Sure.
What does engaging the limbic system, for example, have to do with learning?
Well, think about it. The limbic system is all about emotions.
Yeah.
So engaging it means you're connecting to the material emotionally,
Uh-huh.
which makes it way more memorable. When you get completely lost in a good novel,
Oh,
you're
yeah.
feeling all the characters' joys and sorrows.
For sure.
Those stories, they stay with you long after you've finished the book.
That's true. It's like how you remember emotionally charged events in your own life more clearly than like what you had for lunch yesterday.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about these other circuits, like especially this Zyed circuit?
Well, that's where things get a little less clear.
Okay.
The author doesn't really go into too much detail about the specifics of each circuit.
I see.
But the point is that reading engages your brain more fully than, say, passively listening to a lecture.
Okay, so it's not just the words themselves, it's how our brains are working to understand them.
Right.
But how does that translate into, like, better learning?
Well, the author argues that this active engagement leads to something he calls brainpage development.
Brainpage development.
It's like your brain is building these intricate mental maps, as opposed to just, memorizing isolated facts.
Okay, I like that visual of a brain page.
Yeah.
So you're not just cramming information in, you're creating a framework to understand it.
Right.
Is that where this whole book-to-brain learning comes in?
Yeah. The author contrasts this with the traditional teacher-to-student learning model,
Okay.
suggesting that this more direct engagement with the text can lead to a deeper understanding.
So instead of relying on someone to break things down for you, you're going straight to the source.
Exactly.
But is that really more effective, though? I mean, what makes this book-to-brain method better than having a teacher?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And to be honest, the article doesn't totally address,
Okay.
but he does point to a few potential benefits,
Okay.
like faster knowledge acquisition because you're setting the pace,
Huh.
less cognitive overload because you're not being bombarded with information all at once, and potentially even better problem-solving skills because you're grappling with complex ideas on your own.
Okay, so it sounds like the author's making the case that reading isn't just about absorbing facts, but it's actually training your brain to become a more powerful learning machine.
That's a good way to put it. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that while book-to-brain learning has its merits, there's also a lot to be said for the guidance and support of a good teacher, especially when it comes to complex topics.
That's true. Learning doesn't always have to be a solo thing.
Right.
But I'm definitely intrigued by this idea of taking a more active approach to reading. So the article mentions some practical strategies for using book reading to actually overcome cognitive blindness, right?
It does.
Tell me more.
Yeah, it does. It all starts with active reading,
What do you mean?
highlighting key takeaways, taking notes in the margins, and summarizing chapters in what the author calls brainpage modules.
Brainpage modules.
It's all about actively engaging with the text instead of just letting your eyes glaze over the words.
Right. Yeah. I can definitely see the value in that. I'm a big fan of highlighting and note-taking myself. It helps me focus and process what I'm reading. But what are these brainpage modules?
Think of them like mini mental summaries.
Okay.
So instead of just highlighting random sentences, you're creating concise summaries that capture the key concept of a section.
Gotcha.
This forces you to synthesize the information, put it into your own words, which really helps with understanding and retention.
So it's like you're creating your own little study guide as you go.
Exactly.
I like that. What else does the article suggest?
Well, there's this technique the author calls thalamic cyclizide rehearsal.
Thalamic cyclizide rehearsal.
Which sounds pretty intimidating, I know.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's basically just a fancy term for something we all know is effective. Repetition.
Okay, hold on. Thalamic cyclizide rehearsal, you lost me.
Right. It is a mouthful. Basically, it means reading and rereading important sections to really solidify your understanding. It's like when you're studying for a test and you keep going over the key concepts until they're just second nature to you.
Right. Okay, that makes more sense. Repetition is key for sure. So it's not just about reading a book once and then being done with it.
Well,
It's about going back and revisiting those important parts,
exactly.
kind of building those brain page modules along the way.
Yeah. And the article also suggests mixing up your reading material.
Okay.
Don't just stick to nonfiction. Fiction can be a great way to boost your imagination and empathy.
That's a good reminder. Sometimes I get so caught up in learning about practical things that I totally forget about just the power of a good story.
Right.
But how does reading fiction help with cognitive blindness exactly?
Well, think about it. A well-written novel forces you to step into the shoes of different characters, understand their motivations, and navigate all these complex relationships and scenarios. Right. And all of that exercises your brain in ways that can actually translate to better understanding and problem solving in real life.
I never thought about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. It's like a mental simulation almost.
Right.
Okay, so fiction for empathy and imagination, nonfiction for facts and critical thinking.
Yep. Good mix.
What else?
Well, the article really stresses self-assessment and reflection.
Okay.
It's not enough to just passively absorb information.
Right.
You need to test yourself on what you've learned and think critically about how it applies to your own life.
Okay, so instead of just highlighting and summarizing, you're also asking yourself, okay, how does this connect to what I already know? How can I use this information?
Exactly.
I'm guessing this ties back into that whole active engagement thing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership of your learning and making those connections. The article even suggests trying to explain what you've learned to someone else.
Oh, yeah.
Because that forces you to really solidify your understanding.
That's a great tip. Sometimes the best way to learn something is to try and teach it.
Right.
And it makes you realize how much you actually do or don't know.
Exactly. And finally, there's this intriguing idea of group discussions and miniature schools.
Group discussions and miniature schools. Those sound interesting. Tell me more.
Well, group discussions are pretty self-explanatory. It's about talking about what you've read with other people.
Yeah.
Sharing perspectives, challenging each other's ideas, which can help you identify gaps in your understanding and see things from different angles.
Kind of like we're doing right now, right?
Exactly.
Bouncing ideas off each other.
Exactly. But miniature schools are a little different.
Okay, what are those?
It's like a book club, but the article describes them as more like peer-led learning groups.
Okay.
Where everyone's taking turns teaching each other about different aspects of a topic.
I see.
So it's like a collaborative deep dive.
Okay.
Which can be a really powerful way to learn.
I love that idea. It combines that self-directed learning with the social aspect.
Yeah.
So it seems like all of these strategies are pointing towards a more intentional, engaged approach to reading, rather than just passively consuming words on a page.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
It's about making reading an active experience.
Right.
And the article's call to action really emphasizes this. It encourages readers to make reading a daily habit, engage in brain page development by summarizing and reflecting, and even try this thalamic cyclizide rehearsal technique.
Which, as we learned, is just a fancy way of saying reread the important stuff.
Right.
Okay, so the author, Shiva Narayan, is clearly very passionate about this whole learnography concept.
Yeah, yes.
And believes that book reading is a key tool for combating cognitive blindness.
Uh-huh.
But what's the takeaway for our listeners, even if they don't buy into all of his ideas?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we really underestimate the power of picking up a book.
Yeah.
It's not just about entertainment or escape.
Right.
It's a way to actively engage your brain and enhance your ability to learn.
I completely agree. And even if you don't subscribe to every single aspect of learnography,
Right.
I think there's a lot to be said for this emphasis on active reading. Just being intentional and engaged with the text rather than just letting it wash over you.
It's like the difference between skimming an article and really digging deep to understand it.
Exactly. And the best part is it's something anyone can do. You don't need any special tools or anything,
Yeah.
just a book, your brain, and the willingness to engage.
Exactly.
So for our listeners who are ready to take that plunge and dive deeper into the world of books, what's one small change they can make today to make that experience more active?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I think you could start by just being more mindful of your reading habits.
Okay.
Instead of just racing through a chapter, take a pause and ask yourself,
Yeah.
what are the key takeaways here? How does this connect to things I already know? What questions does this raise for me?
Those are great starting points. And it's not about becoming a speed reader or memorizing every single detail.
Right.
It's about building those brain pages, those frameworks that help you really understand and remember the information.
And don't be afraid to experiment with different techniques either.
Yeah.
Try highlighting key passages, taking notes in the margins, or even summarizing chapters in your own words.
Right. See what works for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about finding what clicks with your own learning style.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into cognitive blindness and the power of reading, what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I just say embrace the joy of learning.
Okay.
Don't let information overload, drag you down.
Yeah.
Rediscover the simple power of a good book and just let yourself get lost in those pages.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
Well said. It's been a fascinating journey from darkness to insight, all thanks to those books.
It has.
So go forth, dear listeners, and conquer those bookshelves. Unleash the power of your brain, and who knows what amazing insights await you. Happy reading.